They mocked me at Grandpa's funeral, then his lawyer called my name first. Elizabeth Kowalski stood in the back corner of a funeral home in Millbrook, Ohio, wearing a plain black dress she had bought that morning because she hadn't owned anything appropriate for a funeral in years. Nobody had greeted her when she walked in. Nobody had saved her a seat. She had driven 3 hours from Columbus that morning alone, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles ached, rehearsing what she would say if anyone asked why she hadn't visited more. Nobody asked. Nobody needed to. They had already decided the story of who she was, and they had decided it a long time ago. Her grandfather, Walter Kowalski, was gone. 81 years old, a man who had built a hardware store from nothing and raised a daughter who somehow turned into someone he barely recognized in his final years. Beth had loved him with the kind of quiet, stubborn devotion that doesn't announce itself. She had never told anyone that for the last 3 years of his life, she made the tower drive to see him almost every single weekend. She never mentioned the medication schedules she memorized, the nights she sat beside his hospital bed doing nothing but holding his hand while machines beeped around them, the small kindnesses that nobody witnessed and nobody would have believed if she'd told them. She hadn't told anyone because her Aunt Carol had made it clear, years earlier, that Beth's visits weren't welcome if they came with any hint of attention. "Don't make this about being the favorite," Carol had said once, her voice sharp as a paper cut. So Beth had stopped mentioning it. She simply kept showing up, quietly, without an audience, because she wasn't doing it for credit. She was doing it because she loved him. Now she stood at his funeral, and the family that had spent 15 years treating her like an afterthought was about to remind her, one final time, exactly where she stood in their eyes. The funeral director gestured toward the front rows, where the immediate family was seated. Beth took a step forward, and her cousin Danielle intercepted her with a tight, practiced smile. "Oh, we're actually full up front," Danielle said, loud enough for 3 people nearby to hear. "There's room in the back with the extended family." Beth was an extended family. She was Walter's granddaughter, same as Danielle. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded and found a seat in the overflow room, where a small television screen streamed the service to people who weren't important enough to sit in the actual room. As the eulogies began, she heard her Aunt Carol's voice carry from the podium, warm and performative, describing herself as the daughter who had been there through everything. Beth pressed her lips together and said nothing. Behind her, she heard someone whisper, just loud enough to be heard, surprised she even bothered showing up. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to see their faces to know exactly who had said it or exactly what expression was on it. She had come to say goodbye to the one person in her family who had never once made her feel like she was too much, or not enough, or somehow less than everyone else in the room. And in return, they couldn't even give her a seat. Beth remembered, sitting in that overflow room with the small television screen flickering in front of her, the first time she truly understood how her family saw her. She had been 26, newly divorced, sitting at her own father's funeral while relatives she barely knew whispered behind cupped hands about what had really happened in her marriage. Nobody had asked her version of events. Nobody had needed to. Carol had already told everyone what to think, and the story had spread through the family like water, finding the lowest point, settling into every crack until it hardened into accepted fact. Beth had spent years afterward believing that if she simply worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, showed up often enough, she might eventually earn her way back into the family's good graces. Watching her grandfather's funeral unfold from a room meant for people who didn't matter, she finally understood that no amount of quiet devotion had ever been going to change their minds. She had been cast in a role years earlier, and nothing she did seemed capable of rewriting it. At the reception afterward, held in the community hall behind the funeral home, the real performance began. Beth stood near the coffee station, holding a paper cup she wasn't drinking from, when Aunt Carol clinked a spoon against a glass and called for everyone's attention. The room quieted. Carol straightened her blazer and announced, in the tone of someone delivering good news at a business meeting, that the family would be meeting with Walter's attorney in 3 days to sort out what's fair regarding the estate. She didn't look at Beth when she said it. She didn't have to. Danielle laughed under her breath, glancing sideways, and murmured something to Uncle Ray that made him smirk into his drink. Beth felt her face grow warm, that old, familiar heat of being talked about in a room while pretending not to notice. She thought about leaving. She thought about getting into her car and driving the 3 hours home to Tom and never looking back, never subjecting herself to another family gathering, another reminder that no matter what she did, she would always be the outsider who married beneath them, who left town, who didn't visit enough, according to people who had no idea how much she had actually shown up. But something kept her rooted to that spot. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the small, persistent hope that somewhere in all of this, her grandfather had actually seen her, really seen her, even when no one else had. That night, back at the modest motel on the edge of town, Beth sat on the edge of the bed and called her daughter, Sophia, who was 20 years old and had inherited none of her mother's tendency toward quiet self-erasure. Sophia listened to the whole story, the overflow room, the whispered comment, Carol's announcement, and when Beth finished, there was a long pause on the line before Sophia said something that would stay with Beth for the rest of that week. "You did the work, Mom. Don't let them write you out of the story, too." Beth didn't sleep much that night. She kept thinking about a box her grandfather had given her 6 weeks before he died, during one of her final visits, when his hands had grown too weak to hold a coffee cup without shaking. He had pressed the box into her hands and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, to keep it safe. She had assumed it was sentimental clutter, old photographs, maybe some of his tools, things too painful to look at yet. She had put it in her closet at home and hadn't opened it since. The next morning, before she could talk herself out of it, she drove to a small storage unit she'd rented near her mother's old house, where she'd left a few boxes of her own things years ago, and found the one Walter had given her sitting exactly where she'd left it. She sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit and opened it for the first time. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, from every single visit she had made over the past 3 years. Walter had kept them all, printed and dated on the back in his careful, deliberate handwriting. There was a photo of the two of them on his porch during his last good summer, another of her adjusting his oxygen tank while he grinned at the camera like it was the funniest thing in the world. Beneath the photographs was a leather journal, its pages filled with his handwriting, documenting his final years in fragments, doctor's appointments, small joys, and, increasingly, his private thoughts about his family. Beth's hands trembled as she read entry after entry. He had written about Carol's visits, which had grown shorter and more transactional over the years, often revolving around finances rather than affection. He had written about Beth, too, how she never asked him for anything, how she showed up even when he was too tired to talk, how she had once driven through a snowstorm just to sit with him during a scary night in the hospital. Near the back of the journal, tucked between 2 pages, was a folded note referencing conversations with someone named Marcus about making things right. Beth didn't know who Marcus was yet. She would find out in 3 days, when the reason her grandfather had trusted her with that box would become devastatingly clear. She drove back to her motel with the box on the passenger seat, her mind racing. Something had shifted inside her, not vindication exactly, but a fragile, cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, her grandfather had known the truth the whole time, even when everyone else had chosen a different story. That evening, she called Sophia again, and this time her voice shook as she described what she had found. Sophia was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, and then she asked a question that Beth hadn't let herself consider yet. "Do you think Grandpa knew what was going to happen at the will reading? Do you think that's why he gave you the box early?" Beth didn't have an answer. She sat on the edge of the motel bed long after they hung up, flipping through the photographs again, studying her grandfather's face in each one, searching for some sign of what he had known and when he had known it. In one photograph, taken only weeks before he died, he was looking directly at the camera with an expression she hadn't noticed before, not the tired, medicated look that had become familiar in his final months, but something sharper. More deliberate, almost like a man setting something in motion and quietly watching to see if it would take root. She barely slept that night, and when she finally did drift off, she dreamed not of the funeral or the whispered insults, but of her grandfather's porch in summer. The two of them shelling peas into a metal bowl while he told her stories about building the store from a single rented storefront with a loan he'd been too proud to ask his own father for. She woke before dawn with the peculiar, hollow ache of missing someone freshly, as though the grief had reset overnight, sharper than it had been even at the funeral itself. The morning of the will reading arrived gray and overcast, the kind of Ohio sky that seemed to press down on the whole town. Beth dressed carefully, choosing not the same black dress from the funeral, but a simple gray blazer, something that made her feel like herself rather than like a guest at someone else's tragedy. Tom had offered to drive up and be there with her, but she'd told him to wait. She needed to face this part alone, the way she'd faced most of the last 15 years alone. The law office of Marcus Chin sat on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street, above what used to be a bakery when Beth was a child. She climbed the narrow staircase and found the waiting room already crowded. Carol, Ray, Danielle, and two other cousins Beth hadn't spoken to in years, all seated in a tight cluster of quiet, expectant energy. Carol glanced up when Beth walked in, her expression flickering with something between surprise and irritation, as though she hadn't quite expected Beth to bother showing up for this part either. Nobody offered her a seat near them. She took one by the window instead, the box from the storage unit resting on her lap, its weight strangely comforting. At exactly 10 o'clock, a side door opened, and a tall man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses and an unhurried, careful manner stepped into the room. He introduced himself as Marcus Chin, Walter's longtime attorney, and asked everyone to follow him into the conference room. Beth felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the name from her grandfather's journal. The conference room had a long table, and the family arranged themselves around it with the practiced efficiency of people who had already decided, in their minds, exactly how this was going to go. Carol sat at the head, as though by instinct, as though the seat belonged to her by birthright. Beth sat near the far end, closest to the door, the box still in her lap. Marcus Chin opened a leather folder, adjusted his glasses, and looked around the table with the calm, measured patience of a man who had delivered difficult news many times before. And then, without any preamble, without the polite throat-clearing everyone expected, he spoke a name that silenced the entire room. Elizabeth Kowalski, he said, looking directly at Beth. Walter asked that we begin with you. The room went utterly still. Carol's mouth opened slightly, as though she meant to say something, but nothing came out. Danielle's eyes darted toward Beth with something that looked almost like panic. Beth herself sat frozen, certain she had misheard, certain there was some mistake, some clerical error that would be corrected in the next sentence. But Marcus Chin didn't correct anything. He simply continued, his voice steady and unwavering, explaining that Walter had come to his office 18 months earlier, alone, and asked to revise his will. At the time, Marcus admitted, he had assumed it was routine, an update to reflect changing circumstances, the kind of adjustment elderly clients often made. But Walter had been unusually specific that day. He had told Marcus, in this very room, that he had finally seen who actually showed up, and that his estate needed to reflect the truth of his family, not the performance of it. Carol's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "This is absurd," she said, her voice tight and controlled in the way voices get when someone is trying very hard not to shout. "I handled everything for my father. I managed his finances. I was there." Marcus Chin didn't raise his voice or argue. He simply opened the folder further and slid a document across the table, along with a sealed envelope addressed, in Walter's unmistakable handwriting, to the entire family. "Walter left a letter," he said quietly. "He asked that it be read aloud before we discuss the specifics of the estate." Beth felt her heart pounding as Marcus opened the envelope and began to read her grandfather's words in his measured, unhurried voice. The letter began simply, almost conversationally, The way Walter always spoke, no dramatics, just plain, honest truth delivered without apology. He wrote about building the hardware store from nothing after coming back from the war, about raising Carol as a single father after Beth's grandmother passed, about the years he had spent believing that loyalty and love were the same thing as visits and holiday cards. He wrote that it had taken him far too long to understand the difference. And then, in a passage that made Beth's breath catch in her throat, he wrote about the day, several years earlier, at her own father's funeral, an event Beth remembered with a pain she rarely let herself revisit. When Carol had turned nearly the entire family against her, spreading quiet accusations about Beth's divorce and her supposed selfishness, accusations that had calcified into accepted truth over the years, repeated so often that nobody bothered to question where they'd come from. Walter wrote that he had watched it happen from a distance, too passive at the time to intervene, and had regretted his silence every day since. He wrote that in his final years, as his health failed and his family's true colors became harder to hide, he had watched Beth show up, week after week, asking nothing, expecting nothing, simply being present in a way none of his other relatives had managed. And he wrote that he intended, in whatever way he still could, to make things right. Carol's composure cracked audibly, a sharp intake of breath, but Marcus continued reading, his voice unwavering. The letter moved into more specific territory now, territory that made the room's temperature seem to drop several degrees. Walter wrote that in the past several years, he had discovered discrepancies in the accounts Carol had claimed to be managing on his behalf. Money moving in patterns that made no sense for an aging man's modest expenses. He had quietly investigated, working with Marcus, and had come to understand that his daughter had been borrowing against his assets, significant sums, repeatedly, without his knowledge or consent, to cover debts that Walter later learned were tied to her husband Ray's gambling. Ray's face had gone a shade of gray that made him look older than Walter had been in his casket. Carol turned to him, her expression a mixture of fury and disbelief, as though this were news to her too, though the flicker of guilt in her own eyes suggested otherwise. Walter's letter continued, explaining that he had chosen not to confront Carol directly while he was alive. He hadn't wanted to spend whatever time he had left in conflict, and he hadn't wanted to publicly humiliate his daughter, whatever her failures. Instead, he had quietly restructured his estate, moving the bulk of his unencumbered assets, the hardware store itself, his savings, the modest but meaningful nest egg he had built over decades, into a trust that Carol could not touch, naming Beth as both the primary beneficiary and the executor responsible for carrying out his final wishes. The room was silent except for the sound of Marcus turning the page. Beth sat gripping the arms of her chair, tears sliding down her face without her fully registering they had started. She wasn't crying from joy or from vindication, though both of those feelings were somewhere in the mixture. She was crying because for the first time in over a decade, someone had put into words exactly what she had lived through, not as an accusation against anyone else, but simply as the truth, finally spoken aloud, finally witnessed. Marcus finished reading the letter and set it down gently on the table. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Danielle stared at her mother with an expression Beth had never seen on her cousin's face before, something between confusion and dawning realization, as though pieces of her own life were rearranging themselves into a picture she didn't recognize. Ray stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Carol simply sat, rigid and pale, her carefully maintained composure finally completely gone. Beth became aware, distantly, that everyone in the room was now looking at her, waiting to see what she would say or do, as though her reaction would determine what happened next. She thought about all the ways this moment could go. She thought about the years of quiet exclusion, the whispered comments, the overflow room at the funeral, the casual cruelty of being told there wasn't space for her at her own grandfather's memorial. She thought about how easy it would be, in this moment, to let all of that anger finally have its say. But she also thought about her grandfather's hands, thin and trembling in his final weeks, gripping hers with whatever strength he had left. She thought about the version of justice he had described in his letter, not public humiliation, not revenge for its own sake, but simply the truth, finally allowed to exist. She stood up slowly, the box from the storage unit still tucked under her arm, and asked Marcus if she could have a private conversation with her aunt before any further steps were taken. Marcus agreed, and the rest of the family filed out of the conference room in a stunned, uneasy silence, leaving Beth and Carol alone at the long table. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Carol's hands were folded tightly in her lap, and when she finally looked up at Beth, her expression wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't the cold superiority Beth had grown used to either. It was something rawer fear, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed story has just been dismantled in front of witnesses. Beth told her aunt, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, that she wasn't interested in destroying her. She wasn't interested in taking Carol's home, or exposing the debts publicly, or turning this into the kind of family scandal that would follow Danielle and her cousins for the rest of their lives. She said she had thought about it, she wouldn't pretend otherwise, but that kind of victory felt hollow to her, borrowed from a version of herself shaped entirely by other people's cruelty. Instead, she laid out what she wanted. She would forgive the money Carol owed the estate, money that, legally, Beth now had every right to pursue. In exchange, she wanted two things. First, an honest conversation between them, not a performance for an audience, about the years of exclusion and the lies that had shaped how the rest of the family saw Beth. Second, she wanted a portion of the estate, money that would have otherwise simply sat in an account, redirected into a scholarship fund at Millbrook High School, in Walter's name, for students who showed the kind of quiet, unglamorous perseverance her grandfather had always valued more than any diploma or title. Carol didn't respond right away. She sat very still, staring at the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than Beth had ever heard it. She admitted, haltingly, that she had spent years telling herself a story where she was the good daughter and Beth was the ungrateful one, because it was easier than confronting what she had actually done, both to her father's trust and to her own family. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't the cathartic, tearful reconciliation Beth might have imagined in an easier version of this story. It was halting and incomplete, the kind of admission that comes from someone who has been cornered rather than someone who is fully changed. But it was something. And Beth, for the first time in a long time, let herself simply accept it for what it was, without needing it to be more. Before she left the law office that day, Marcus Chin walked her to the top of the narrow staircase and told her something that hadn't been in the letter, something Walter had apparently said to him off the record during one of their final meetings. He said Walter had worried, near the end, that Beth might refuse the inheritance altogether out of some misplaced sense of guilt, that she might try to split everything evenly with a family that had never once split anything evenly with her. Walter had asked Marcus to make sure she understood that this wasn't a reward for good behavior, and it wasn't a punishment aimed at Carol. It was simply the truth of his life, finally recorded honestly on paper. Beth stood at the top of those stairs for a long moment after Marcus went back inside, looking out the window at Main Street below, at the hardware store 2 blocks down where she had spent so much of her childhood, and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't expected, not triumph, but a kind of permission she hadn't known she was still waiting for. Over the following weeks, the practical details of the estate were settled. Marcus handled the paperwork with the same quiet precision he'd shown from the beginning, and Beth found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, taking an active role in the process, reviewing the hardware store's finances, meeting with a handful of longtime employees who had worked there for decades and were anxious about what would happen to their jobs, walking the familiar aisles of the store where she had spent countless childhood afternoons trailing behind her grandfather while he restocked shelves and told her the names of every tool in the building. She decided, after much deliberation, not to sell the store. Instead, she began converting a portion of the building, a section that had sat mostly unused for years, filled with old inventory and boxes of receipts going back decades, into a small community space. It would house the new scholarship program, along with a modest reading room and a bulletin board where local students could post resumes and job listings, a place Walter had always wished the store could become, but never had the resources or the time to build. Sophia drove up from her college dorm on weekends to help with the renovation, sanding down an old counter that would become the front desk, hanging photographs of Walter throughout his decades running the store. Tom joined them too, taking time off work to help with the physical labor, and Beth found herself, for the first time since the funeral, laughing freely in that building, surrounded by people who loved her without conditions or agendas. Word spread through Millbrook about the scholarship fund, and about the story behind it, though Beth was careful never to frame it publicly as anything other than an honor to her grandfather's memory. She didn't mention Carol's debts, or the whispered comments at the funeral, or the overflow room where she'd been forced to sit while her aunt performed grief at the podium. She let that part of the story remain private, something she carried quietly, the same way she had carried her weekly visits for 3 years without ever asking for recognition. Carol's apology, when it finally came in full, arrived not as a grand gesture, but as a handwritten letter, delivered to Beth's home in Columbus nearly 2 months after the will reading. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't excuse the years of exclusion or fully reckon with everything Beth had endured. But it acknowledged, plainly and without deflection, that Carol had spent years choosing convenience over truth, and that she regretted the years Beth had spent feeling like an outsider in her own family. Beth read the letter twice, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something like peace. She didn't write back immediately. She let the letter sit on her counter for several days, occasionally glancing at it as she moved through her kitchen, and slowly, without any dramatic decision, she found herself softening toward the idea of a relationship with her aunt that looked nothing like the one they'd had before, smaller, more honest, built on actual truth rather than the polite fictions that had governed their family for years. On a bright Saturday morning in early autumn, nearly 6 months after Walter's funeral, Beth stood in the newly renovated section of the hardware store, now bearing a small brass plaque near the entrance that read the Walter Kowalski Community Room. Folding chairs had been set up for a modest ceremony, and a crowd of perhaps 30 people had gathered, former employees of the store, teachers from the local high school, a handful of Beth's own family members, including, somewhat awkwardly but genuinely, Carol and Danielle, who had asked to be included and had shown up early to help set out refreshments. The first scholarship recipient was a 17-year-old girl named Priya, who worked 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a rigorous course load, quiet and unassuming in the way that made people overlook her until they actually paid attention. When her name was announced and she walked up to accept the modest plaque and the first installment of her scholarship, Beth felt something rise in her chest that she hadn't expected: recognition, maybe, or a kind of tenderness for the version of herself that had once been exactly that unassuming, exactly that easy to overlook. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed and Tom began folding up chairs with Sophia's help, Beth found herself alone for a moment in the community room, standing near the small shelf where she had placed some of her grandfather's old tools, preserved not as museum pieces, but as a reminder of the hands that had built this place from nothing. She reached into her bag and pulled out the leather journal, the one she had found in the storage unit all those months ago, and opened it to the final pages she hadn't been able to bring herself to read until now. The last entry was dated only a few days before Walter passed, his handwriting shakier than in earlier pages, but still unmistakably his. He had written about the fear of dying, the strange peace that had settled over him despite it, and then, near the very end of the entry, a single line that Beth read 3 times before she let herself fully absorb it. He had written that Beth didn't know it, but she was the only one who had ever loved him without wanting something back. She stood there for a long moment, the journal open in her hands, tears sliding freely down her face, not the sharp, painful tears of the funeral home overflow room, but something gentler, something closer to release. She thought about all the years she had spent believing that her love for her grandfather had gone unnoticed, unremarked, invisible to everyone, including, she had sometimes feared, to him. And she understood now, standing in the room built from his life's work and his final wishes, that he had seen her all along. Every visit, every quiet Sunday afternoon, every moment she thought had passed unnoticed had been witnessed and remembered and honored in the end. Sophia found her a few minutes later, still standing by the shelf, and wrapped her arms around her mother without asking any questions. The way only a daughter who has watched her mother carry an invisible weight for years knows exactly when comfort is needed more than words. Tom joined them shortly after, and the three of them stood together in the quiet room, sunlight filtering through the front windows of the store that had once been the center of Walter Kowalski's entire life, and was now becoming something new, something that would outlast all of them. Danielle appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, hesitant, holding a stack of folded chairs she didn't quite know where to put. She had stayed later than the rest of the family, helping clean up long after her mother and stepfather had left, and she lingered now, watching Beth wipe her eyes, unsure whether to intrude. Beth waved her in, and for a moment the two cousins simply stood together among the shelves, saying nothing. Then Danielle spoke, quietly, admitting that she had spent most of her adult life assuming her mother's version of every family story was the only version that existed, because it had never occurred to her to ask for another one. She said she was sorry, not with the polish of a rehearsed apology, but with the awkward, unfinished honesty of someone realizing, for the first time, how much of her own life had been built on assumptions she'd never examined. Beth didn't offer an easy absolution. She simply told her cousin that it wasn't too late to ask better questions, and that she was glad Danielle had finally started. Beth thought, in that moment, about the woman who had stood in the back of a crowded funeral home 6 months earlier, dressed in a hastily bought black dress, unacknowledged and unwelcomed by the very family she had quietly served for years. She thought about how easy it would have been to let that humiliation define the rest of the story, to let bitterness calcify into something permanent, the way Carol's careless cruelty had calcified into accepted family truth for over a decade. Instead, she had chosen something else. Not revenge, though she'd had every opportunity and every legal right to pursue it. Not forgiveness offered too quickly or too cheaply, the kind that erases real harm in the name of easy peace. She had chosen something slower and harder and, ultimately, more honest, a reckoning that made space for accountability without requiring cruelty, that honored her grandfather's final wishes without losing herself in the process. She closed the journal gently and placed it back in her bag, knowing she would return to its pages many times over the years, whenever she needed reminding of who had truly seen her and when. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long across Main Street, illuminating the brick storefront that had stood for over 50 years, weathering every storm, every economic downturn, every family conflict that had played out within its walls and around its dinner tables. It would stand for many more years now, transformed into something that served not just her grandfather's memory, but an entire community of quiet, unglamorous people who showed up, again and again, without asking for recognition. Beth locked up the community room that evening, the brass plaque catching the last of the sunlight as she turned the key, and walked out to her car where Tom and Sophia were waiting. She didn't look back as she drove out of Millbrook that night, not because she was running from anything, but because for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't leaving as the outsider, the black sheep, the one who never quite belonged. She was leaving as exactly who she had always been, the granddaughter who showed up, whose grandfather had seen her clearly, and who had finally, after everything, allowed herself to be seen by the rest of the world too. The scholarship fund grew over the following years, expanding to support several students each semester, funded partly by the hardware store's continued operations and partly by a small trust Beth maintained personally, adding to it whenever she could. Priya went on to become the first recipient to graduate college, sending Beth a photograph of her diploma with a handwritten note thanking her for believing in a stranger's potential. Beth kept that photograph on her refrigerator for years, a small, quiet reminder of the good that had grown out of the worst weekend of her life. Her relationship with Carol never fully healed into the close bond some families manage after reconciliation, but it settled into something functional and honest, occasional phone calls, a shared understanding that the past couldn't be erased, but could, at least, be acknowledged. Danielle, surprisingly, became the one who reached out most often, visiting Beth in Columbus a handful of times over the following years, slowly rebuilding a relationship that had been poisoned for most of their lives by assumptions neither of them had ever questioned. And every year, on the anniversary of Walter's death, Beth drove back to Millbrook alone, the way she used to drive to visit him every weekend, and spent an afternoon in the community room bearing his name. Sitting quietly among the shelves and the photographs and the small plaques honoring each year's scholarship recipients. She would open the leather journal to that final entry, read the line about being loved without expectation, and allow herself, for just a few minutes, to feel the full weight of everything she had carried and everything she had finally, rightfully claimed. She never needed the rest of the family's approval again after that first year. She had already received the only validation that had ever truly mattered, not spoken aloud in a crowded room, not announced by a lawyer with a folder of legal documents, but written quietly in the private pages of a dying man's journal, meant for no one's eyes but his own, until the moment his granddaughter finally opened the box he had trusted her to keep safe. In the end, that was the justice Beth had been looking for all along. Not the money, though it had changed her life in practical ways she was grateful for. Not the humiliation of the family members who had mocked her, though there was a quiet satisfaction in watching truth dismantle the stories they had told about her for years. The real justice was smaller and larger than either of those things combined. It was simply being seen, fully and finally, by the person whose opinion had mattered most all along and learning, in the process, that she no longer needed anyone else's permission to know her own worth.